Okay. So, we were talking, we just finished up the conversation about students and kind of it's, the circumstances that they're facing with housing and such. And I think it's kind of fitting that I want to open this up for us to all talk about Chapter 2, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But for me, I actually wanted to kind of start it off with a quote. And it's the very opening. Anybody who's read this for any number of times knows that you can pretty much pull something from everywhere. But one of the things that stood out, very related to what we're talking about, is this particular one. It's the very first page of Chapter 2, and it says, "And as an individual perceives the extent of dehumanization, he or she may ask if humanization is a viable possibility." And I think that's really important when we're talking about change, because so often we're bogged down and we think that it's very impossible for us to make change, right? In this case, he's talking about humanization, but sometimes even the small things like being able to have, things discounted or refunded because it's a moneymaker seems very daunting and impossible. But obviously, it's much larger than just that. But I kind of wanted to open it up with that particular sentence because he goes on to say, within history, in concrete objective contexts, both humanization and dehumanization are possibilities for a person as an uncompleted being conscious of their incompletion. So I kind of wanted to open it up with that, with a conversation, like start talking about this idea of humanization and how frequently we believe it to be impossible. So thoughts or additional quotes or, experiences, anything that you have, anybody here, if you'd like to share or reflect with us.
I think it's funny to bring up this quote, Charlene, because actually just last week I had a student ask me a question about conflict theory. And this was in Social 101, and we were talking about how structural functionalism and conflict theory contrast, and he was saying, well, conflict theorists point out how people have been oppressed and marginalized, but it seems that at every instance where there was a kind of quest for humanization or liberation or the end of oppression, it just seems like inequality still persists in perhaps a different form or an even worse form. And I just said, no, that may be true, but that doesn't mean that that's something that we're fated to, right? And indeed, and that's something that Freire talks about so much, is this idea of fatalism. And oh, did I freeze? Okay, sorry, my bad. I thought I froze. I think something that Freire reminds us of is that just because just because we haven't seen the world that we endeavor after before doesn't mean that it's impossible, right? Because if only if what was achievable is only things that we've already seen in the past, well, then there would be no hope for anything different from the present. So that's what I think of when I think of humanization, hope, and as we were talking about towards the end of last week, being the permanent recreators of the world.
I think that's great. I thought that was interesting too, Calvin, that you brought that up, because on page 44, the one that popped out was when he writes, "The struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed." And I think sometimes we think that it's so deeply, that it's natural, right, that this is what's going to happen.
I'll say something with respect to This is a reading that, I will send these out to you guys. Uh, I've had a chance because of COVID to be able to classify all kinds of readings that I've had in my documents and PDF files that was just all over the place. And finally, I've had enough time, just a little bit, to be able to organize them and categorize them. So this is another one of a short little piece by Darder, but this one was written by Brian McKenna, who actually worked with Darder quite a bit. And so he was the first author, but this is part of what he says. He says, let me see. Freire mentored youth to engage in conflict or engage conflict, not plant trees. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is strewn with references to Marx, Lenin, Castro, and Guevara. There can be no civic engagement without identifying the oppressors, as some universities might have it. This whole thing is about how universities actually try to remain neutral in the face of oppression. Such an idea grossly distorts the man's politics and erases his significance. Obviously, it should have been distorts, a person's politics and their significance. For the oppressors, wrote Freire, what is worthwhile is to have more, always more, even at the cost of the oppressed having less or having nothing. For them, to be is to have, and to be the class of the haves, right? So I think understanding that, this is where I think we run into so much frustration when we're actually going up against like what you just experienced the last several days and weeks, Calvin, right? Because you're actually going at the university personnel with this in mind, right? Whereas they're so far from even understanding why you are so frustrated, right? Like, why are you so combative, right? Because these people, I think, almost as mouthpieces for those people who are in positions of power, a lot of the university administrators, and of course, people who work throughout that, the administrative body. But I must say, a lot of faculty members as well, right? As we know, probably overwhelmingly, most faculty members operate in the space of neutrality, right? So I think that's it. I think one of the things that I think will be interesting is, right? You are not doing this just because you have plenty of time on your hands. You are actually reacting against a set of issues, principles, and experiences that have been dumped onto you that is unjust, right? So the idea is, hey, to be able to engage conflict, to be able to fight, right, is not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it may be the only thing that we could actually do, right? We need to fight when we're faced with an unjust situation, right? Because if we do not, guess what? We become almost complicit, right? So I think these are the kind of things that I think we need to impress upon our students and others who are trying to understand these kind of things, right? So along with that, let me just say, unfortunately, says Giroux, many of Freire's followers have reduced his pedagogy to a methodology or a set of teaching techniques. What has been lost in this analysis is Freire's legacy of revolutionary politics. And we all know that, right? That's why so many times we've said, I've said this until my, turn blue in my face. You guys heard me say this over and over. I wish he never had written chapter 2, right? or at least the way he wrote it, right? I mean, but although he does reclaim all of these things and make it very clear towards the end, right? But so many people just use the first 2 or 3 pages of chapter 2, because that's the only thing that actually kind of makes sense, right? Because throughout, I mean, this guy is quoting people like Edmund Husserl. I mean, they're not going to understand that, right? So then those things just become just bunch of words put together, right? So in some ways, I think because Freire comes from a philosophy of ethics, and majority of us have never been taught systematically, right, any kind of thing to do with ethics, we just then operate under what we know best, and that is techniques, right? How to do things. I mean, in some ways, I'm frustrated, but I don't blame a lot of the teachers who turn Freire into nothing more than a technique or methodology. Because in some ways, they're trying to make sense of what he's saying the best that they can, right? With what they got. And what they have is very limited understanding of philosophy, right? Which then speaks greatly about our educational system, So it's not that, I think the teachers are dumb. I just think that many are just trying to make sense of what he's saying the best they can. Now, that doesn't mean, right, that they should do better. Of course they should do better, right? I mean, you can't just say, well, I tried my best. Well, you know what? Your best actually continued the oppression, so you got to try something else, right? So, but like I said, it doesn't have to be either or.
I thought it was interesting too that you would talk about that, Jay, because on page 46, he writes, even revolution, which transforms a concrete situation of oppression by establishing the process of liberation, must confront this phenomenon. Many of the oppressed who directly or indirectly participate in revolution intend, conditioned by the myths of the old order, to make it their private revolution. The shadow of their former oppressor is still cast over them. And I find so many people that I talk to, right, that hold this dear and close to them really kind of fall into this trap. And that's not to say that we're completely immune to it either, right?
Of course.
But like, I think that being aware of it is such a huge, it's so hugely important, because I do feel like that's what ends up happening, is that it's that idea of problem posing, like you said, being reduced to merely a method in the classroom, rather than recognizing it as a connection to, the larger political world and how that's impacting the students, on an individual level and as a collaborative, and collective group. And I just find it so fascinating, because it's so many things, so many methods and how-tos, and that's what people like tend to kind of gravitate toward, whether you have your faculty development or your professional development or whatever it is, it's always how to do this or what to do and methods for this. And while those are important to some extent, there's the problem is that if you are using, right, these methods or tools that end up just reproducing the status quo, then they are just that. They are merely methods and tools which are not being used to be this radical, transformative kind of political education, which is necessary to really understand where we're at and what we're doing, and why some people are not in that spot, or, and whatnot.
Absolutely.
And I think that this connects well with just on the following page. This is a quote that we go back to all the time. But of course, at the beginning of the second paragraph, says, the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom.
Where are you on? What page are you on?
47? 47? Yeah.
Okay.
The first full paragraph?
Yes.
Yeah. So second sentence now, freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. So this is it's funny, the kind of ideas that we've just discussed in terms of certain teachers appropriating fairies ideas in such a way that doesn't really call into question the structure or the perverse ethics, as Professor Che always says, so reflected so in society in terms of inequality and oppression. And actually, I don't know, maybe Paul would be comfortable with speaking to it a bit, but he was telling me even about one of his teachers who really says Freire, this is Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a good book. I really like Freire, but teaches an economics class and makes very equivocal statements about capitalism and about social inequality.
Yeah.
And really connecting back to what Charlene was speaking about. Well, too often we do have teachers as such who think like, okay, as long as I do my part, or I consider these ideas, or I enact these ideas, but also like you were saying, Professor Che, at a very superficial level that doesn't really, that is not radical by any means, right? And ultimately it represents an internalization or being a host of the oppressor, and a fear of being able to imagine something truly different.
Sure. So it's almost the same thing as these days, those who are members of the Republican Party or the Conservative Party, right, celebrating the life of MLK Jr., right? How's that possible, right? I mean, think about it. The whole Conservative Party rests on the word itself, right? Conservative Party comes from the root word conserve. Conservatives do not want social change, folks, right? Conservatives want status quo. That's what their entire thing is based on, right? And if there is change, they want very slow change, right? Almost so slow that it's almost changing, almost like nature changing, right? That it doesn't disrupt the given order, right? That's what conservatism. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was exactly opposite of that, right? He's saying we need a change now, right? So how is it possible that conservatives actually then celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. other than as a show of being disingenuous, right? So in that sense, I think this is why we need to be clear about what we say. We need to call out these kind of issues, and we gotta bear witness, right, to these kinds of contradictions. Anybody who actually teaches economics from the position of capitalism, but also says Freire was that book is pretty cool. Nah, right? Either the person is a liar or didn't understand the book, or does not have the courage to be able to accept what the book says and then transform or change his or her life from what he or she is doing, right? And that's what he says. Kelvin, if you were to continue reading that paragraph, can you continue? He says, image replaced with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of human beings, nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion, right? So the idea is, what he's saying is, hey, in order for us to be a complete human being, guess what is indispensable, right? The act of us having the courage to fight on behalf of freedom for you, for me, for everybody else. If we can't do that, we will continue to toil as incomplete human beings, and in some ways as monsters, right? Yep. I mean, what separates human beings from other animals, right? I know people say it's the dot, and all, of course, it's the symbol that we use, right? Language that other animals don't have as much, right? We have a complex, sophisticated, and all that, right? But you know what also separates human beings from a lot of other animals is we have something called a set of ethics that we decided that we're going to actually share and commit to, right? I mean, in some ways, it's really simple, right? And this is why people that do not have a moral compass at times disgust us, right? Because the idea is, hey, as a human being, why are we not engaged in something that makes us human, right? And that is ethics, the fight for freedom for everyone, the idea of the idea of justice, you know. And I often quote Martin Luther King Jr. on this, right? Like, as he says, peace is not simply an absence of conflict. It's an overwhelming presence of justice, right? Absolutely, right? You could have absence of conflict and not have peace, folks, right? You could have absence of conflict. By the way, I'm sorry, you have a lot of absence of conflict in totalitarian societies, fascistic societies, right? Yeah, there's no conflict. They're being oppressed, right? But that is not a peaceful society. So I think, you know, we got to do it in every level. And I appreciate, you know, all of us who are on here on Wednesdays, continuing to think about these, right? And helping, you know, and working with other people so that we could actually bear, even if it's a small injustice, right? Because it means something to their daily lives, right? Yeah. For a lot of the EOP students that Calvin talked about this earlier today, I mean, for anybody, but shoot, man, $2,000 is a lot to pay, like a penalty, right? $200 is a lot to pay as a penalty. What the hell? What are we as a university start imposing penalties? What kind of craziness is that if you think about that, right? I mean, are we the IRS? I mean, this is like crazy that universities are imposing penalties. You know, absolutely absurd. But anyway. Do you guys have any questions? And you said, what were your names again?
Paul?
Paul?
Law.
Long. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Please feel free to jump in and ask or comment, whatever you want to do. Gabby, any thoughts?
Hey there. Sorry, I missed a lot of the conversation because of my son.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah, he's a hot mess right now.
Yes.
And his dad is actually, he was laid off and he's doing some under the table jobs. So it's been kind of just tough to balance, you know.
Of course.
Little one.
Of course. Of course.
I didn't get to read the chapter. I mean, I read it before, but
Sure.
I'll share this one that I kind of relates to a lot of craziness, you know, even that's going on.
Sure.
It's on page 50, and it says, to affirm that men and women are persons, and as persons should be free, and yet do nothing tangible to make this affirmation a reality is a farce. And I didn't really get to hear Calvin's story with the university,
Right.
but I kind of had my own personal stuff. I'm at Point Loma Nazarene, and you know, originally they told me I can do my fieldwork hours at my job, which would have been perfect because I would have still got paid and been able to do an intern.
Of course.
And we're a charter school, and last minute they said we don't have an MOU with charter schools anymore, that we're completely taking them out, which was like 2 weeks before I was supposed to start my fieldwork.
Oh my gosh.
And I wrote a letter to the president, And he actually responded, and he said, "Let me get back to you, blah, blah, blah." And then my professor gave me some talk about how it was a liability issue. And it was funny because I emailed my boss, who's the principal, and a bunch of people from the university. And I said, "We're willing to do the MOU, blah, blah, blah." And they write back to my boss and not to me. And they say, "I'm sure Gabrielle told you that it was a insurance issue. That's just what we tell our students, but it's bigger than that." But it was just
What?
crazy. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So I was like, "Geesh," and I wrote back to the president and I said, "You guys put all these barriers in our way, and this is why people of color drop out."
Of course. Of course. Gosh. So what's your situation right now with them?
So I'm still in school, but I'm gonna be doing my hours at a community. It's a juvenile court and community school, and it kind of worked out because I have a friend there and I graduated with them, and
Right.
and because of COVID and everything, I'll be doing it virtually.
Right.
So in a way, it worked out. But I had already went part-time to do my hours
Of
after I
course.
was told I couldn't do it at my job. So it's just a bunch of hot mess.
No, no, of course. And you know what? You were lucky enough that you actually had a connection or somebody that, it worked out, the secondary, right?
Right.
How about those that they don't have that kind, right?
Yeah,
Of
exactly.
luck.
Yeah.
I think these are kind of things that, again, I know that, it's so sucks because you know why? Because the people that have the least amount of time, because most minorities are spending so much time having to wade through all this bullshit that they are faced every day, right? Just imagine, just think about how many hours throughout the week that you are having to do extra work that maybe most white folks will not be doing, right?
Yeah, sure.
Because they're not actually having to deal with racism, sexism, right? Culture, right? And many different things.
Still living at home.
I'm sorry?
Still living at home.
Yes. I mean, if you are actually able to add up those hours, those are significant number of hours, right? But not only physical hours, how about mental and emotional drain, right? Those all work. I mean, these are all body blows that so many minorities have to deal with on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like somebody mentioned not too long ago, hey, in our country these days with COVID and everything, right? Of course, they were talking more specifically about African Americans, or Blacks, but for generally minorities altogether, including women, hey, who you are, the color of your skin, and your gender actually is a precondition in our society, pre-existing condition, right? Yeah, because if you're actually Black, guess what? It's almost a pre-existing condition that your life will likely be cut a lot shorter than whites, right? Than your white counterpart, right? Whether it is through health issues, whether it is through gun violence by the police, right? Whether it is by having only 8 cents to $1 for wealth that white folks have, right? Tremendous amount of other issues. Yes, your skin color, the way you look, gender, right? Your abilities, and so on. It all becomes almost, right, the pre-existing condition.
Right.
Right? So
yeah, and that's why that quote kind of spoke to me too. I have a lot of friends too who couldn't get through programs because they need to work.
Of course. Of course.
So it's like,
so Quran.
Sorry.
It's okay. That's why I was saying, it sucks because we have so much on our plate, and yet, who actually has to do the work to call these people out? Yes, the same people that have so much on our plate, right? So I think maybe, like that kind of thing that you just went through, right, Gabby? The kind of thing that you're going through, Kelvin, right? Maybe they might want to pick that up, right? So, you know, there is the San Diego Voice or whatever that is, right? Voice of San Diego
Voice
or
Viewpoint or something. Voice of
yes,
View-
there are more local newspapers, right? Not the Union Tribune,
Yeah, yeah.
but some of the other ones. I think they might be really interested in some of these stories, right? And I
Mhm.
think again, you know, you don't have to do it, but at least consider it. And like I said, it sucks that those people who have so much on their plate are the ones who still have to engage in the moral work, right?
Mhm.
That's why, you know, minorities are always tired. That's why when they say, man, I don't want to do your work, right? To a lot of our white counterparts. When they're like, what should I do? I don't know, man, figure this shit out, right? You figured out everything else, right? You figured out great ways to oppress people. You figured out ways to swindle people. You figured out ways to actually rob people. You figured out a way to actually loot an entire continent, bring people over here. You figured out a way to destroy half of the world. You figured out a way to make the people from Middle East and Muslims all into terrorists. You figured out a bunch of ways, right? So why don't they figure out a way to undo some of the things that they've done, right? And this is why so many minorities are tired, right? Of even so-called white allies who say, how can I help, right? Hey man, if you don't know how to help, right? That's another burden for me to actually educate you on how to help, right? You created a machine that continues to break my leg and now you're coming to me and asking, how do I help? You know, man, it just doesn't work out like that, right? So I get it. And then you know what the crazy thing is? Again, some of our liberal white allies, they ask, how can I help? And they get a response like I just said, and they turn around and say, well, you see, they don't even want help. They get mad at people who want to help them. You know? Yes, it is. It is, we're in a very, very difficult situation. So that's why I think we gotta actually attack this from multiple levels, different multiple prongs with many people. And again, when I keep saying white folks, and I do, but I think ultimately speaking, white folks who actually understand and have the kind of worldview that Freire is talking about, absolutely. Those are the people who are not going to be asking you, how can I help? They're already doing things, right? And I don't know if you folks realize, but chapter 2 also is the shortest chapter in this book, right? So in a country where reading is not a common cultural thing to do, right? Everybody zeroed in on the shortest chapter, man. Right?
Yeah, I always find that interesting because while we're not talking about chapter 3, I actually really like chapter 3 a lot because of its criticism of obviously because being in sociology, but the criticism of like typical research,
Yes.
which in itself objectifies, right? Like you think about IRB and they call them human subjects, and it's like that is literal objectification at that point, right? Well, literal in terms of words, but like you are objectifying them, though. You are turning them into subjects, not into human beings. So chapter 3 actually is one of the ones that I like to go through a lot, because of that reason, because of a recognition of that. But he, what he talks about in chapter 3, he does touch upon in chapter 2 briefly for me, not completely, but in a sense of collaboration as opposed to like that top-down model, which really is true to us as an organization, where, you know, when we first started as an organization, our big thing was we are not going into neighborhoods and we're not helping people. We're not working, you know, we're not saving anybody. We're not helping people. We're working with community. We're working with and collaborating. Like, it's never ever been the idea of, like, you know, that saviorism or helping, because that is a very, very, you know, patronizing and dehumanizing, you know, kind of language around it too. That doesn't mean that needing help is a problem, right? Like, we all need help individually, of course. But by the idea of, like, you know, these communities needing help, it tends to dismiss the structural oppression that has made it to where they you know, quote unquote, need help.
Sure.
And so, but what he talks about in on page 48 for me really always stands out. And he says, this book, it's the second to the last paragraph, and he says, this book will present some aspects of what the writer has termed the pedagogy of the oppressed, a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed, whether individuals or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from that reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation, and in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade.
Sure.
And so I really like that, specifically that first sentence, because it's a pedagogy that must be forged with and not for. And I also feel like that, you know, one of the things that some of my students have struggled with, and some people, you know, just in general, reading through it the first time, is that they feel like his book in itself is the banking method, because it's telling you what to think, and it's telling you what to do. But I feel like that paragraph in itself is really important, because in fact, that contradicts that idea, because what he's saying is that there is no, like, and that actually goes back to what you were saying, Che, too, like how they reduce it to a mere method, because this actually is saying that it's not a method, right? It's saying that it has to be completely forged and remade over again and again, if it's done in a liberatory, collaborative way. And that is the only way for liberation, is if it's done, you know, and it's remade over and over again accordingly.
Sure. And I think so many teachers and people, again, they are misguided when they say something like, well, but isn't he telling us how to do things? Well, that's part of teaching. There's a difference between a banking method and actually teaching somebody, right? Banking method ends with the outcome is monological and one-dimensional and universal, right? The outcome has to be universal, is the banking method. Whereas what Paulo Freire is saying is, hey, you have to engage and make the world, remake the world. So he's not telling you how to remake the world. He's telling you the conditions that we are living in gets in the way of us practicing freedom to make the world, right? Now, if you're gonna turn around and say, yeah, but he's telling us something, well, then I guess we can't ever talk to each other, right? I mean, we'll just have to just be silence, right? So again, I think those criticisms are so, like, you know, off-centered and non-legitimate. And those are, of course, criticisms that are coming from people that really haven't thought these things through, right?
And I would actually go so far as to say that, you know, especially, you know, students who haven't been introduced to, you know, for the sake of the book, problem posing, I think that it's in their head, a legitimate criticism though, too, right? Because we've reduced all of these things to a method as opposed to a transformative, you know, like kind of, and recognizing education as a political action, right? I think that not saying that it is a legitimate criticism, but I think that in many people's heads it is, because of that reason, because it's been reduced to a method that they see it as anti-lecture. Like, I mean, I've read articles from, you know, published researchers who talk about how you know, the lecture, like how lectures are important, and that they are anti, you know, Freire for that reason, and they completely have missed the point. And so I think that because we do reduce things so much to a how-to, as opposed to, you know, back to what we were saying earlier, the philosophical and these things, I think I think that's where a lot of that criticism comes from too, which goes back again to the, you know, lack of problem posing in education.
Sure. Sure. But I am glad, like I said, that he does save this chapter at the end. It's the final paragraph on page 86. It says, problem posing education does not and cannot serve the interest of the oppressor. No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. While only a revolutionary society can carry out this education in systematic terms, the revolutionary leader need not take full power before they can employ the method. In the revolutionary process, the leaders cannot utilize the banking method as an interim measure justified on grounds of expediency, with the intention of later behaving in a genuinely revolutionary fashion. They must be revolutionary, that is to say, dialogical from the outset. And I think this is so important because, you know, people are always saying, hey, you know, just, you know, work within the system until you reach the position of power, right? A lot of times when they're saying that is, what they're saying is adopt the way the system is until you reach the position of power. Well, what Freire is saying is that can't be done that way, right? It's almost like living your life inauthentically until a certain kind of magical point where you say, okay, I'm gonna start living my life genuinely, right? He's saying, hey, as a human being, you need to live your life genuinely from the outset, right? From the get-go, you have to commit to live your life genuinely, right? Yep. Why would we have? So, you know, when somebody says, well, but let's just work within the system until, I will be a translator for Freire. What he would say to somebody who says, I will, you know, let's work within the system until we could change it. He'll say, not only are you being disingenuous and not genuine, but you are also, right, not exercising any type of courage to fight on behalf of freedom. And that's okay. I'd rather somebody says I'm scared. Yep. Rather than to try to hide behind the idea, hey man, don't be so radical, right? Don't be so silly, right? Let's strategize here so that let's just work within the system until we could change it. Yep. I don't know hardly anyone that's ever succeeded in doing that, but I've heard a bunch of people say that, right? And usually people who say that at the end will more than likely be engulfed by the system and just become part of the system.
Is this fun? Do you come to? No, you only came to high school. He said the same thing, man.
Yeah, it's already 8:15, almost 8:20, folks.
I think that's good. I actually think that I'd like to maybe next week cover just a little bit more of chapter 2, more just at the beginning, just a little bit to talk about it in terms of like our the personal experiences.
Sure.
You know, because we've kind of talked a lot about like the big ideas and the concepts involved with this. But I think that really kind of breaking down our personal experience is important because I think about my own education, and I think a lot about how like I was actually introduced to a lot of problem posing methods in middle school. And not as a method, right? When I say method, I mean, you know, actual problem posing, and being able to connect my literature in English and history to larger socio-political things. But I also think about how like, you know, that is such a rarity, and that stopped when I hit high school.
Of course.
So it was very odd to think about that. So I would like us to kind of maybe think about what we've talked about today and reflect on our own experiences for next week when we connect, at least at the beginning of it. And then I'm going to send out some other readings for us to kind of go over now in terms of education and kind of narrowing in on some other topics and stuff for next week.
You know what? I think that's a fantastic idea, Charlene. I don't think we need to actually try to move on from chapter 2 so quickly.
Okay.
Right? And I think maybe it would be great if we could also hear some personal experiences.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, so the readings that I plan on sending out, I'm going to send out more like as supplements to chapter 2, just kind of
Sure.
like like additional readings from maybe Giroux or Dardere or any of them, basically
Sure.
to kind of just think about these roles. Like there's a lot that can go in connection with chapter 2, whether we're talking about multicultural education or we're talking about really anything, because there's a lot that I think we are seeing that ends up being a matter of false generosity in these efforts, right? So about the idea of like looking like we're doing something good, as a larger kind of efforts without it really being true, really kind of digging at the root. So I think that that's a great idea for us to kind of continue
Sure.
chapter 2 and talk about personal experiences for next week.
Absolutely. And also for those of you who are there, it's Saturday at 3, right, Charlene?
The 3:30.
3:30. We're gonna have the community kind of thing. It's gonna focus more around Asian American experiences, right? And not only experiences, but maybe we could, kind of introduce some history of Asian Americans.
Right.
So